Welcome to this week's episode of Basics of Programming. This episode will be on loops in Java and how to use them. As always, the video will be divided into two sections, essential knowledge and additional information. Feel free to skip ahead to section 2 if you already know how basic loops in Java. With that out of the way, let's begin. Part 1, Essential Knowledge on Loops in Java. First off, what are loops in Java? Loops are structures that repeat a block of code until a given condition becomes false. You can think of them as structures that perform an action, then use an if statement, and if that if statement is true, repeats the process. There are two main types of loops in Java, for loops and while loops. A while loop takes a condition and immediately checks to see if that condition is true. If it is, the block of code is run, and the process repeats. You can think of a while loop as the most basic level of loop in Java, and while loops are an important part of most languages. You generally use a while loop when you do not know when a condition will be fulfilled, such as when you're getting user input or waiting for a boolean to change status. You can also use the keyword do before the block of code, and put the while statement at the end, which runs the block of code once before checking the condition and looping. If a while loop is the most basic form of code, you can think of a for loop as a while loop with extra features. A for loop takes an initializing statement, followed by a semicolon, then a condition followed by another semicolon, then finally an action to complete at the end of each loop, which is often increasing a counter variable by 1. For loops are used much more often than while loops, and are usually used either to repeat a set number of times, or when looping a certain number of times, such as looping 10 times, or a number equal to the size of an array. Now we have a couple examples of loops. The first image shows an example of a while loop. In this loop, the body of the while loop is run repeatedly until the user inputs Q. The scanner variable here is just an object that lets us read user input. In the second example, we can see a for loop being used. In this case, the loop first initializes variable I as value 5, then tells the loop to continue while I is less than or equal to 10, then tells the program to increase I by 1 or increment I at the end of each loop. As you can see in the output, this program starts with I is equal to 5, finds that I is less than 10 and enters the loop, prints its statement, then increments I and repeats this process until I is more than 10. Something to note is that if we do not want to initialize a variable, or do something at the end of the loop, we can remove these statements as long as we leave the semicolons. In fact, you can take any while loop and replace while with for, then add a semicolon to either side of the condition, and you have a functionally identical loop. Now on to part 2, additional information on loops in Java. First, let's move on to break and continue, which are not loops but are used with them. Break and continue are keywords that act to skip parts of a loop, with both skipping the block of code beneath them, and break also skipping the condition check and looping. You can think of break as breaking out of loop entirely, while continue continues on to the next iteration of the loop. Break is most useful alongside an if statement when a loop needs to check a second condition at a different time than the loop condition. For example, if you are looping a number of times and using elements from the array, you may need to check if the next array element is null, and if so, break out of the loop. Continue is used less often, but is extremely useful when you want to skip the main action when a condition is met. For example, if an element in an array is null, you can use continue to skip that element without breaking out of the array, or being forced to create a large if-else block to ensure that you do not enter the action. Finally, let's talk about one more very useful loop, the augmented for loop. An augmented for loop, also known as a for each loop, uses the same keyword as a normal for loop, but instead of parentheses, there's only a variable declaration, followed by a colon, and an array or collection of the same type as that variable. Augmented for loops iterate over every element in the array or collection, setting the declared variable equal to the element in the array or collection each time. In this way, an augmented for loop is functionally the same as a for loop that checks that a counter is less than the collection size, then sets a variable equal to the element at that counter's index. However, augmented for loops have distinct disadvantages compared to normal for loops. In particular, changing the declared variable does not change the array element, and since there is no index variable available to that programmer, it's much easier for a normal for loop when to change each element in an array. As such, augmented for loops are used primarily to perform an operation using each element in the array, such as summing each element in an int array or printing out each element in a collection. And with that, today's episode comes to an end. Feel free to leave comments below. I would love to see what you thought about the episode or any feedback on the format. And if you have any topics you would like to learn, please let me know below. Next week's episode will focus on arrays. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you better understand loops in Java.